Welcome to Strategic Affairs. In the middle of London's historic streets where old stone walls whisper the memory of kings and empires, a new construction plan shook the foundations of British politics. It was not a skyscraper, not a shopping mall, not even a museum. It was an embassy. But not just any embassy, the largest Chinese embassy ever planned in the world. Set to rise in East London. At first glance, it seemed like another diplomatic project. Nations build embassies everywhere. The bigger the country, the bigger the embassy. But from the moment details of this plan leaked to the public, the mood changed. The story began to spread in newspapers, through television, and across online debates. Britain was quietly preparing to host China's most powerful diplomatic fortress right in the heart of its capital. The chosen location was no ordinary site. China had its eyes on Royal Mint Court, a historic plot of land opposite the Tower of London, one of Britain's most iconic landmarks. The irony was striking. Where once English monarchs guarded their wealth and minted coins of sovereignty, now a foreign power was preparing to build a mega embassy. For many, this felt less like diplomacy and more like symbolism, a statement that China's presence in London was permanent, dominant, and impossible to ignore. Residents of Tower Hamlets, the borough where the embassy was planned, were the first to raise questions. Why here? Why such a massive structure in a neighborhood already struggling with housing shortages, traffic, and strained local resources? For ordinary people, it wasn't just about politics. They imagined the endless security checks, the cameras, the restrictions around their streets. Would their lives turn into living next to a fortress? But behind these local worries was a larger storm brewing. Britain's intelligence services and political analysts started connecting the dots. A Chinese embassy of this size was not simply about visas, cultural exchanges, or trade talks. It was about power projection. It was about surveillance. And it was about sending a clear message. China was not just a trading partner anymore. It was staking a claim in the very heart of Britain's capital. The size of the proposed embassy was staggering, nearly 10 times bigger than China's current diplomatic building in London. It would have enough space to house hundreds of staff, large meeting halls, underground facilities, and possibly hidden rooms that no one outside Beijing's circle would ever know about. This was not just an embassy, it was a command center. British politicians began to feel uneasy. Memories of previous confrontations with China resurfaced: the protests in Hong Kong, the Huawei 5G controversy, and accusations of Chinese espionage across Europe, allowing the world's most secretive superpower to build its largest embassy next to one of Britain's most historic landmarks raised red flags that could not be ignored. Soon the whispers turned into accusations. Was this embassy a Trojan horse? Would it become a hub for spies working under diplomatic cover? Could it be equipped with surveillance equipment capable of monitoring nearby government buildings, banks, or even the Tower of London itself? These questions weren't paranoia. They reflected real fears about how China had operated in other countries. Reports surfaced that Chinese embassies across the world were often used for more than official business. Defectors and intelligence leaks suggested they sometimes acted as coordination hubs for influence campaigns, cyber operations, and surveillance networks targeting diaspora communities. If that was the case, then the largest Chinese embassy in the world, built on British soil, could become a direct threat to national security. But politics is never simple. For Britain, the decision wasn't just about security, it was also about money. China had been one of the biggest investors in London real estate, infrastructure, and energy. Billions of pounds flowed through deals with Chinese companies, and many British leaders feared that angering Beijing could cost the economy dearly. London wanted to remain a global financial capital, and Chinese money was part of that equation. Could Britain afford to say no? This was the heart of the dilemma. National security versus economic survival. A superpower knocking at the door with promises of investment, but carrying the shadow of surveillance and control. Some called it progress. Others called it surrender. Meanwhile, on the streets of Tower Hamlets, resistance was growing louder. Local communities, activists, and even some council leaders began voicing opposition. They warned that their borough was being turned into a geopolitical chessboard where ordinary lives were just pawns. Protests began to form. Banners carried by residents who felt unheard by the state. For them, this wasn't just about spies or embassies. It was about their homes, their streets, and their future. The clash between community and state, between diplomacy and distrust, began to build. Tower Hamlets was no stranger to struggle. A borough with deep immigrant roots, it had long been a place where global politics met local life. Now, once again, it found itself at the center of a battle much larger than itself. As the debate heated up, the media poured fuel onto the fire. Headlines screamed of espionage fears, national betrayal, and looming surveillance towers. Television hosts asked whether Britain was selling its soul to China. Commentators described the embassy as a fortress rising out of London's historic heart. And each story made the public more uneasy. British intelligence agencies, though silent in public, were reportedly urging the government to reconsider. Too much was at stake. they argued. Allowing China to establish such a powerful base could undermine Britain's alliances with the United States and Europe, who were already suspicious of Chinese influence operations. Washington especially had been warning London to be cautious. The embassy wasn't just a local issue. It was becoming an international test of loyalty. Inside Parliament, politicians clashed over the issue. Some argued that rejecting the embassy would inflame tensions with Beijing at a time when Britain needed trade deals. Others insisted that security came first, that Britain could not allow itself to become a playground for foreign powers. Behind closed doors, heated arguments took place, with intelligence officers presenting confidential reports, and ministers weighing risks against rewards. But as the months passed, one truth became clear. The embassy wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of China's rise, Britain's uncertainty, and the growing divide between economic necessity and national pride. By the end of the first wave of debates, one thing was undeniable: Britain was afraid. Not afraid in a sense of panic, but in the quiet, serious way that nations fear losing control of their destiny. This embassy was more than bricks and mortar. It was a question mark hanging over the future of Britain's independence, sovereignty, and security. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic diplomatic battles in modern British history, and at the center of it all was a simple, powerful question. Why did Britain fear China's biggest embassy? The whispers of unease around China's planned embassy in London were no longer whispers. They had grown into a storm that touched every layer of British society, from the quiet anxieties of residents in Tower Hamlets to the fiery debates in Parliament. What once looked like a simple diplomatic expansion now carried the weight of espionage, sovereignty, and national survival. The central fear was one that could not be ignored: espionage. Britain's intelligence services had long tracked Chinese operations across Europe and beyond. It was no secret that Chinese embassies sometimes played roles far beyond diplomacy. There were stories of buildings acting as hubs for intelligence gathering, where staff with diplomatic immunity monitored dissidents, spied on rival nations, or coordinated influence campaigns. And now, with the largest embassy in the world planned on British soil, those fears multiplied. Security experts painted a chilling picture. Imagine a fortress in the middle of London, equipped with cutting-edge surveillance technology. Imagine antennas disguised as rooftop structures, windows fitted with listening devices, underground facilities shielded from detection. From such a base, intelligence officers could monitor communications, track movements, and even map the habits of nearby institutions. And what stood across the street? The Tower of London, a site drenched in symbolism, but more importantly, just a stone's throw from the financial district and major government offices. The idea that a foreign power could have such a commanding position in the capital was unsettling. British intelligence officials, though careful not to speak openly, were deeply worried. Some insiders admitted that an embassy of this size could become the perfect cover for hundreds of operatives. And once the building was up, there would be little Britain could do. Diplomats carry immunity. Their activities, no matter how suspicious, are shielded by international law. This was not paranoia. Across the world, there were precedents. In the United States, intelligence reports had suggested that Chinese consulates were used for espionage, leading to the closure of China's consulate in Houston in 2020. In Europe, whispers of hidden surveillance operations tied to Chinese embassies were growing. And in countries like Canada and Australia, accusations of Chinese interference in politics had shaken governments. Britain could not ignore the pattern. But espionage was not the only fear. There was also the issue of community surveillance. Chinese embassies and consulates had long been accused of keeping tabs on members of the Chinese diaspora abroad, especially those who opposed Beijing's policies. Students, activists, and exiles from Hong Kong, Tibet, or Xinjiang often reported intimidation, threats, and pressure from people linked to Chinese diplomatic missions. If the new London embassy became a hub for such activity, thousands of people living in Britain could suddenly find themselves under watch. For the people of Tower Hamlets, the fears were closer to home. Residents pictured streets lined with barriers, checkpoints, and armed guards. They imagined their neighborhood transformed into a restricted zone, where protests would be suppressed and voices silenced. Some said it felt like they were being asked to host a fortress that served a foreign power, while their own needs, affordable housing, schools, healthcare, were ignored. Protests began to grow louder. Meetings were held in community halls, banners appeared on the streets, and petitions circulated online. "We don't want to live next to a spy base," one resident declared during a heated town meeting. Another warned, "This isn't an embassy, it's an occupation." These words struck a chord, not only with locals but with people across Britain who began to see the embassy as more than just a Tower Hamlets issue. The media amplified these voices. News outlets painted vivid pictures of a neighborhood caught between a superpower and a struggling borough. Headlines described Tower Hamlets as the front line of Britain's China dilemma. Television reporters stood outside Royal Mint Court, pointing at the empty site and telling viewers that this barren ground might soon hold one of the most controversial buildings in modern British history. The pressure reached Westminster. Inside Parliament, debates became fierce. Some MPs argued that rejecting the embassy would risk Britain's fragile economic relationship with China, especially after Brexit. They pointed out that China was one of Britain's largest trading partners, with billions invested in energy, infrastructure, and technology. Could Britain afford to antagonize Beijing, especially at a time of economic uncertainty? But others fired back with warnings about security. One MP declared, "You don't invite the wolf into your home and then act surprised when it watches your every move." Another said bluntly, "This embassy is not about friendship, it is about dominance." The chamber echoed with arguments that revealed just how divided Britain was over its core relationship with China. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Washington was watching closely. The United States had grown increasingly wary of Chinese influence, and officials were not shy about pressuring their allies to follow suit. Privately, American diplomats urged Britain to rethink the embassy plan. Publicly, U.S. officials spoke of the dangers of allowing adversaries to establish footholds in sensitive locations. For Britain, caught between its old ally and its new trading partner, the pressure was intense. European nations, too, kept a watchful eye across the continent. Governments were re-evaluating their relationships with Beijing. Germany debated the role of Chinese companies and its critical infrastructure. France tightened scrutiny on Chinese investments. The European Union as a whole had begun describing China as a systemic rival. In this climate, Britain's decision on the embassy became a symbol of where it stood in the geopolitical struggle. And yet, for all the noise, China remained calm, at least on the surface. Chinese officials described the embassy project as a simple necessity, the natural result of a growing diplomatic presence in Britain. They spoke of friendship, cultural exchange, and cooperation. But behind the polished language, critics saw something else, a carefully calculated strategy to normalize China's dominance in the heart of the West. By now, the embassy had become more than just bricks and blueprints. It was a battlefield of narratives. To some, it represented opportunity and partnership. To others, it symbolized surrender and danger. And for the people of Tower Hamlets, it was a looming shadow over their daily lives, a project decided far above their heads, yet destined to change their streets forever. The battle was no longer just about whether an embassy should be built. It was about what kind of future Britain wanted. A future tied to China's economic power, or one defined by independence and security. A future where communities had a voice, or one where global politics silenced them. As the debate raged on, one thing became clear. Britain's fear of China's biggest embassy was not just about a building. It was about power, influence, and the uneasy realization that the world was shifting beneath its feet. And this was only the beginning. The real struggle was yet to come when decisions would have to be made. Alliances tested, and the true cost of saying yes or no to Beijing revealed. As weeks turned into months, the tension surrounding China's embassy project grew heavier. What began as neighborhood protests and parliamentary debates had now transformed into something far larger. Test of Britain's sovereignty in an era of global power struggles. Every headline, every whisper from intelligence agencies, every protest banner added fuel to the fire. The story was no longer confined to Tower Hamlets. It had spilled across the nation. Newspapers described it as the biggest diplomatic standoff since the Cold War. Television debates featured security analysts warning of hidden listening devices, economists stressing the danger of losing Chinese investment, and activists calling the embassy a symbol of oppression. For ordinary people, it was confusing, even frightening. They wondered, was this simply a building, or was it the beginning of something far more sinister? The residents of Tower Hamlets, who had started the protest movement, now found themselves at the center of a global spotlight. Their voices echoed far beyond London. Videos of their protests circulated online, reaching audiences in Europe, America, and Asia. A grandmother holding a sign that read, "We will not live under China's shadow," became a symbol of resistance. Students, activists, and ordinary families stood together, insisting that the embassy would turn their home into a fortress for spies. Inside Britain's security establishment, the warnings grew louder. Intelligence officers privately admitted that they could not monitor everything that might happen inside such a massive compound. They feared that once the embassy was operational, it would provide China with a strategic vantage point over London's political and financial core. In quiet meetings, some even called it a city within a city, a foreign-controlled stronghold in the heart of the capital. And yet, the situation was more complicated than fear alone. Britain's economy was fragile after Brexit trade deals. With Europe had weakened, and the government desperately sought new partnerships. China, with its vast markets and financial power, seemed like a lifeline. Billions in investment flowed from Beijing into British infrastructure, energy, and technology. Rejecting the embassy project risked jeopardizing that flow. Some argued that Britain could not afford to push China away at such a critical moment. This economic dilemma exposed a deeper question. What price was Britain willing to pay for security? Was it worth risking jobs, investment, and trade in order to stop the embassy? Or was Britain prepared to live with the risk of surveillance and influence in exchange for financial stability? These were not easy questions. and every possible answer carried heavy consequences. In Parliament, the divide deepened. One side accused opponents of paranoia, insisting that diplomacy required trust. Every great power has an embassy, one MP said, and if we cannot live with that reality, then we should admit that Britain is too fragile for the modern world. Another side countered with fiery warnings. This is not diplomacy, one voice thundered. This is infiltration. This is submission dressed up as progress. As politicians fought, outside forces pushed harder. Washington intensified its pressure campaign, reminding Britain of the special relationship. American officials privately shared intelligence assessments, suggesting that the embassy would be a hub for espionage. They warned that cooperation between London and Washington could suffer if Britain allowed the project to proceed. Behind closed doors, U.S. diplomats delivered a clear message. Siding with China would come at a cost. Across the Channel, Europe watched closely. Some governments expressed sympathy for Britain's dilemma, while others quietly criticized London for allowing the project to move so far ahead. France and Germany, both wary of Chinese influence, worried that if Britain approved the embassy it would set a precedent for Europe. Suddenly, London was not only deciding its own future, but also shaping the balance of power across the continent. China, meanwhile, maintained a calm but firm stance. Its diplomats repeated the same lines. This embassy was a natural step, nothing more. They insisted it was about friendship, cultural exchange, and mutual respect. But beneath the calm surface, their language carried an undertone of warning. Rejecting the embassy, they hinted, would damage relations and could lead to consequences: economic, political, even diplomatic isolation. The British public found itself caught in the middle. On the streets, the debate played out in everyday conversations. Taxi drivers discussed the embassy with passengers. Shopkeepers argued with customers. Families debated over dinner tables. Was Britain standing up for itself, or was it risking too much? Was China a partner or a predator? The questions gnawed at the national conscience. The protests in Tower Hamlets did not stop. In fact, they grew stronger. Marches drew larger crowds, with students and activists joining residents. At one demonstration, a speaker shouted into a microphone, "If we allow this embassy to rise, it will not just tower over our streets, it will tower over our freedom." The crowd erupted in cheers. These images spread across social media, creating waves of solidarity across the globe. But, for all the noise, the government hesitated. Each day of delay only made the decision more painful. Approving the embassy risked public outrage and national security fears. Rejecting it risked damaging relations with one of the world's most powerful nations. It was a classic lose scenario, and the clock was ticking. Inside Whitehall, the pressure mounted. Security officials pressed for restrictions or outright cancellation. Trade officials warned against economic retaliation. Political advisors weighed the damage to public opinion. The Prime Minister himself faced sleepless nights, knowing that whichever choice he made would define not just his government, but Britain's role in a rapidly changing world. By now, the embassy had become more than just a building. It had become a mirror, reflecting Britain's deepest anxieties about itself. Was it still the proud island nation that once stood against empires, or had it become too dependent on foreign powers to defend its own interests? Was it still capable of charting its own destiny, or was it trapped between the giants of East and West? The tension reached a breaking point when new revelations emerged. Journalists uncovered leaked documents suggesting that the embassy's design included unusually advanced communications systems. Though China dismissed these claims as fabrications, the news sent shockwaves across the country. Critics seized on the revelations as proof of their warnings, while supporters accused the media of fueling hysteria. The debate grew uglier. Accusations of racism, xenophobia, and fearmongering clashed with warnings of betrayal, cowardice, and national weakness. The embassy had not been built yet, but already it was tearing at the fabric of Britain's politics and society. At the heart of it all, the residents of Tower Hamlets continued to fight. They were not diplomats or politicians, not spies or analysts. They were ordinary people, standing in the shadow of a global conflict. For them, this was not about grand strategy or balance of power. It was about their streets, their homes, their lives. And in their struggle, many saw a reflection of Britain itself, ordinary citizens caught in the middle of a battle between giants. The embassy still stood as an empty plot of land, a promise and a threat rolled into one. But the storm around, it was growing darker. The world was watching, the clock was ticking, and Britain was running out of time to decide. The days turned into weeks, and the standoff over China's planned embassy in London reached a critical point. Every news outlet covered it endlessly. Commentators described it as a geopolitical drama unfolding in real time for Britain. The issue was no longer just about bricks and mortar, it was about identity, security, and the uneasy place the country occupied in a shifting world order. Behind closed doors, the British government struggled to find a solution. Some ministers pushed for a compromise, suggesting the embassy be scaled back, its design altered to ease security concerns. Others insisted that no amount of compromise could erase the risks. You don't build a fortress for spies and then expect them to use it for tea parties, one intelligence officer remarked dryly. Meanwhile, Beijing's patience was running out. Chinese officials began to signal more openly that Britain's hesitation was unacceptable. They warned of consequences if the project was delayed further. The tone was diplomatic, but the meaning was sharp. London was under pressure not only from its own people, but also from one of the world's most powerful governments. The American angle intensified as well. Washington's warnings became louder, both publicly and privately. High-ranking U.S. officials reminded Britain that intelligence sharing between the two allies depended on trust. If London allowed the embassy to proceed, that trust could erode. The special relationship itself seemed to hang in the balance. For ordinary Britons, the crisis felt both distant and personal. It was distant because the decisions were being made in offices and boardrooms far removed from everyday life. Yet it was personal, because the outcome would shape the future of their nation. Many wondered aloud if Britain was still capable of standing firm, or if it had become too vulnerable to the economic and political weight of global powers. The protests in Tower Hamlets reached their peak. Tens of thousands gathered in the streets, waving flags, chanting slogans, demanding that the government stop the embassy at all costs. The area was transformed into a sea of banners and voices, a grassroots movement that defied the might of Beijing. Families marched side by side with students, retirees, and workers. In their chants, the message was simple: we will not be overshadowed. Yet the protests did not silence everyone. In quieter corners of the city, others worried about what would happen if Britain defied China. Jobs could be lost. Trade deals could collapse. Investments in housing, energy, and infrastructure might disappear. For many, survival depended on an economy already stretched thin. Could the country afford to anger one of its largest trading partners? This split in public opinion revealed something deeper. Britain was at war with itself. One side demanded security, sovereignty, and independence. The other clung to pragmatism, survival, and the hard realities of economics. The embassy had become the stage upon which these two visions of Britain collided. The breaking point came when new intelligence reached the Prime Minister's desk. A confidential report suggested that the embassy's planned communications hub was far more advanced than previously known, capable of intercepting signals from across London. Though the report was never made public, it circulated through whispers and leaks, feeding a storm of speculation. To the public, it felt like confirmation of their worst fears. The Prime Minister called an emergency meeting. Advisors filled the room, each presenting their case. The security chiefs demanded rejection. The trade officials begged for compromise. Political strategists warned of elections, public anger, and Britain's fragile place in the world. Hours of arguments passed, but the weight of the decision fell squarely on the Prime Minister alone. When the announcement finally came, the country held its breath. Standing at a podium, with cameras flashing and millions watching, the Prime Minister declared that the embassy project would not move forward in its current form. He cited national security, public opposition, and the need to protect Britain's sovereignty. The United Kingdom will always welcome diplomacy, he said, but never at the expense of our safety or independence. The reaction was immediate. Protesters in Tower Hamlets erupted in cheers, celebrating a victory they never thought possible. Across social media, videos of the announcement spread like wildfire. To many, it was a rare triumph of ordinary citizens against the might of global politics, but in Beijing, the response was cold and sharp. Chinese officials condemned the decision as a violation of diplomatic norms. They accused Britain of bowing to foreign pressure, hinting at economic consequences. Within days, reports surfaced of delayed trade talks, cancelled investments, and diplomatic protests. What Britain had gained in pride, it now risked losing in prosperity. Washington, however, praised the decision. American officials applauded Britain for standing firm, describing it as proof that the alliance remained strong. In Washington's eyes, Britain had chosen the West over China, security over compromise. But this approval came with its own price, the expectation that Britain would follow America's lead even more closely in the years ahead. For the residents of Tower Hamlets, the fight was not over. Though they had won the battle, they remained wary. Some feared that China would try again, perhaps with a smaller project or through backdoor deals. Others worried about retaliation that might affect their community directly. Victory tasted sweet, but it was laced with uncertainty, and for Britain as a whole, the embassy saga left scars. The nation had revealed its divisions, its vulnerabilities, and its dependence on powers beyond its control. It had also revealed its resilience, the ability of ordinary people to shape the course of history. But the cost was high and the struggle was far from over. As the dust settled, one question lingered. What did this episode truly mean for Britain's future? Was it a sign of renewed strength, a country willing to defend its sovereignty against giants, or was it proof of fragility, a reminder that every choice carried consequences it could barely manage? In the end, the embassy was never built, but the battle over it changed Britain forever. It was not just a story about a building or about spies or about protests. It was a story about identity, about the crossroads where East and West collided, and about a nation struggling to decide who it really was in the 21st century. The skyline of London remained unchanged, the empty plot of land still waiting, but in that empty space, a ghost remained, the ghost of what might have been, and the shadow of what still could be. And so, Britain stepped forward, not with certainty, but with the knowledge that every decision in this new age carried the weight of history.